The courtroom was as silent as a graveyard. The air hung heavy with anticipation, as if everyone in that room was holding their breath, waiting for the next moment to unfold. It was a high-profile case, with the eyes of the entire city watching the proceedings. The judge, a woman with deep brown skin and short, natural gray hair, sat high at the bench, her expression stern and unwavering. She had the presence of someone who commanded respect and wouldn't tolerate nonsense, especially not from anyone who thought they could push the boundaries of the law. The defense attorney, a young, well-dressed man with a smug smile, had just made an outlandish claim about the evidence. The prosecutor was quick to rebut, but it was clear from the way the defense lawyer was speaking that he thought he could manipulate the courtroom. That's when the officer stepped in. Officer Burke had been present throughout the trial. He was a heavy-set man, his uniform stretching slightly at the seams, and his eyes were sharp, too sharp. There had been whispers about his attitude towards certain individuals, but no one had paid much attention. His presence had gone unnoticed, until now. The defense lawyer motioned toward Burke, seeking approval for something he intended to introduce as evidence. The judge raised a brow, and before she could say anything, Burke took a step forward. The air seemed to crackle. He was challenging her authority, something that no one had ever dared to do before in her courtroom. "Your Honor, we don't need your approval," Burke said with an edge of contempt, his voice louder than it needed to be. The tension in the room ratcheted up. The judge's eyes narrowed, but she didn't raise her voice. She simply asked, "Officer Burke, do you understand your place in this courtroom?" Before she could continue, Burke stepped closer to the bench. "You're not the one in charge here." "I'm just doing my job," he snapped, a sneer curling on his lips. Everyone in the room stiffened. The judge had remained calm in the face of countless challenges, but this was different. There was something off about Burke's demeanor, something hostile, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The room was tense, utterly still, like the calm before a storm. The judge's gaze didn't waver, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. It was as if everyone in the courtroom suddenly realized how thin the line was between civility and chaos. A murmur rippled through the spectators, and even the stenographer seemed to hesitate before continuing her work. No one had ever seen anything like this in this courtroom. Burke's steps were slow and deliberate as he moved even closer to the judge's bench, looming over her with a self-assuredness that felt almost threatening. The judge's eyes were fixed on him now, no longer just a symbol of authority but a woman who had clearly seen the worst of humanity and had risen above it. "I don't take orders from you," Burke said, his tone laced with a venom that could not be ignored. "You're just a judge. I have the law on my side." The judge remained still, her expression unchanged. But in her eyes, there was a glimmer of something much deeper, something that made you realize just how unwise Burke was to provoke her. She leaned forward slightly, looking him directly in the eye. "Officer Burke," she said, her voice steady and controlled. "You may wear that uniform, but that doesn't give you the right to disrespect this court or me. Take a step back and remember who holds the power here." Burke didn't move. Instead, in a reckless move that seemed fueled by pure arrogance, he reached out, grabbing the edge of the judge's robe in a bold display of dominance. His fingers gripped it tightly, pulling it as though he were trying to intimidate her, but the judge's hand flew out, slapping his hand away with a speed and precision that took the room by surprise. The gasps around the courtroom were audible, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Enough," the judge commanded, her voice now carrying an undeniable weight. "You will not put your hands on me, officer. That is an assault, and you will pay for this." Burke's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and anger. For a split second, it seemed like he might lash out, but before he could do anything, two other officers rushed in, realizing the escalation happening in the room. The judge, calm and composed, sat back in her chair, her gaze unwavering from Burke. She knew what she had to do next. The two officers who rushed in weren't just any officers, they were part of the department's internal affairs team. Their presence wasn't a coincidence. They had been watching Burke for weeks now, ever since rumors of his behavior had started circulating among his colleagues. It was clear from their swift movements that they knew exactly how dangerous the situation had become. One of the officers, a woman named Detective Morales, stepped forward with authority, placing a hand firmly on Burke's arm. "You need to leave, Officer Burke. Now." Burke seemed momentarily disoriented, as though he hadn't expected anyone to actually challenge him. His face reddened in fury, and he yanked his arm away, but Morales didn't flinch. She was calm, focused, her eyes cold with the certainty of someone who knew she was in the right. The judge, still seated at the bench, didn't let up. "You've made a grave mistake, officer. I am filing an immediate report. The assault on me will not go unnoticed." Burke opened his mouth to protest, but Morales silenced him with a sharp glance. He had no words. None that would change what he had done. His career, the one he had built over the years, was already crumbling under the weight of his own actions. Morales gave a subtle nod to the bailiff, who immediately began ushering the remaining spectators out of the room. The doors to the courtroom closed behind them with a heavy thud, leaving only the judge, the officers, and Burke, who stood there, stunned and furious. For the next few moments, no one spoke. The room was thick with the silence of a reality that had just shifted in an irreversible direction. Finally, the judge rose from her seat, her voice breaking the silence like a thunderclap. "Officer Burke, your actions have violated every principle this courtroom stands for. You will be placed on administrative leave while an investigation into this assault takes place. I will personally ensure that the full extent of your actions is made public." Burke's face twisted in anger, but there was a flicker of something else, fear. He knew that in that moment, his career, his life as he knew it, was over. The judge had not only taken control of the courtroom, but she had also taken control of his fate. As he was led out of the courtroom by Morales and the other officers, the judge sat back down, her face stoic but her heart racing. She had done what was necessary. But she knew this wasn't over. The true weight of the consequences was just beginning to sink in for everyone involved. The days following the courtroom incident were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and investigations. Officer Burke was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation, but the damage had already been done. His assault on the judge had sparked outrage in the community, and the media coverage was relentless. Every local news station had picked up the story, and social media was ablaze with opinions, both from those who supported the judge and those who felt the officer's actions were justified. But there was no mistaking the fact that what Burke had done was indefensible. The department, under immense pressure, launched an immediate and thorough investigation, one that would eventually involve the FBI due to the severity of the assault on a public official. The wheels of justice were turning quickly now, and there was no escaping what was coming next. The judge, however, remained calm throughout it all. She had expected some backlash, but she had always believed in the integrity of her position. She knew that standing up to Burke, even at the risk of making enemies, was the right thing to do. She would not back down, no matter the consequences. One morning, several days after the incident, she received a visit from Detective Morales. The two sat in her chambers, the weight of the world on their shoulders. Morales had a file in her hands, one that contained the damning evidence that would seal Burke's fate. "The investigation is moving forward faster than we anticipated," Morales said, handing over the file. "We've gathered testimonies from multiple officers who've witnessed Burke's behavior over the years. Turns out, this wasn't the first time he's crossed the line. We're finding inconsistencies in his reports, his interactions with the public, and we've even uncovered several complaints that were dismissed by higher-ups." The judge took the file, flipping through the pages quickly. The evidence was clear. Burke had a long history of misconduct, one that had been overlooked until now. He had used his position to intimidate, manipulate, and, in some cases, hurt those who couldn't defend themselves. "We have a case now," the judge said quietly. "But this isn't just about Burke. This is about the system that allowed him to do this for so long." Morales nodded. "Exactly. There's a lot more at play here. We're not just dealing with one bad apple. We're dealing with an entire system that failed to hold him accountable. And now it's time for that to change. The two women exchanged a look, one of understanding, of resolve. Burke might have been the one who physically assaulted the judge, but the true battle was much larger. This was about holding a broken system accountable, about making sure that those who abused their power would be brought to justice, no matter their position. As the investigation continued to unfold, the pressure on the police department mounted. The internal affairs team, led by Morales, worked tirelessly to uncover every detail, to leave no stone unturned. Burke's career was already over. But the department's reputation, along with the trust of the public, was hanging by a thread. The story of Officer Burke's assault on the judge had spread like wildfire. The media, as expected, did not let up. Headlines screamed in bold letters, and every major news outlet covered the case with a mix of shock and outrage. The story had captured the public's attention like few others. People were divided, but most agreed that Burke's actions were inexcusable. His position as an officer, sworn to uphold the law, made his assault on the judge all the more shocking. But the media circus was just the tip of the iceberg. In the days that followed, more and more individuals came forward with their own accounts of mistreatment at the hands of Burke. It became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. There were whispers from the community, stories of coercion, intimidation, and an alarming lack of accountability. People who had been too afraid to speak up before were now telling their stories, and the sheer weight of their testimonies was undeniable. The judge, despite the overwhelming support from the public, knew that this was just the beginning. As the case gained national attention, there was an undercurrent of something else brewing, a deeper desire for systemic change. She could feel it every time she walked into the courthouse, saw the crowd outside, or heard the conversations from the attorneys and court staff. People were angry, not just at Burke, but at the larger issues that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked for so long. She spent countless hours in her chambers, reading through the evidence, reviewing the testimonies, and preparing for what would undoubtedly be the most important trial of her career. But it wasn't just about holding Burke accountable anymore, it was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that future abuses of power would not be tolerated. She had the chance to make a real change, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Meanwhile, the internal affairs investigation was gaining steam. Detective Morales was relentless. She uncovered the full extent of Burke's misconduct, and as the pieces fell into place, it became clear that Burke had systematically used his badge to further his own agenda, intimidating people, falsifying reports, and engaging in outright misconduct. His actions went far beyond just a momentary lapse in judgment during a courtroom altercation. He had been exploiting his position for years. But the investigation wasn't easy. There were always whispers that Burke had friends in high places, officers who had turned a blind eye to his behavior. Some of them were complicit, whether they knew it or not. The judge and Morales knew this, and they had prepared for resistance. As the investigation progressed, things began to unravel faster than anyone had anticipated. Burke was no longer the only one under scrutiny. His colleagues, those who had shielded him for so long, were now in the spotlight. The police department was facing an unprecedented crisis. The truth was coming out, and it was clear that there was no way to cover it up. The judge knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. The systemic issues that had allowed Burke to flourish would not be solved overnight. But with each passing day, she felt more determined. The fight had become about much more than just one officer. It was about restoring faith in the system, about proving that accountability could not be bypassed, no matter how powerful the person involved. Weeks had passed, and the pressure was mounting. The public's fury was palpable. Officer Burke's name had become synonymous with corruption, abuse of power, and injustice. The media coverage showed no sign of slowing down, and the growing public outcry was impossible to ignore. But despite all of the noise, the most important day was still ahead, the day when the case would officially be brought to trial. The judge, sitting at her bench, had never felt more focused in her life. This wasn't just another case for her, this was a battle that transcended the courtroom. She was fighting for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by Burke and those like him. She knew that the court would be watching, everyone from the public to law enforcement to the very people she had sworn to serve. Detective Morales had been instrumental in gathering the evidence that would seal Burke's fate. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed, not just with spectators but with a heavy sense of anticipation. The judge stood tall, her robe flowing as she took her seat, her eyes scanning the room with quiet confidence. She wasn't just a judge that day, she was the embodiment of the justice that had been denied for too long. Burke, now stripped of his uniform and facing the full force of the legal system, sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his lawyer. His face, which had once been filled with arrogance, now appeared pale and tense, beads of sweat forming at his brow. The smirk that had once been his signature was gone, replaced by the reality of his actions. The prosecutor stood first, addressing the jury with a composed but fierce determination. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you're about to hear is not just about one man's transgression. This is about the abuse of power, about a system that allowed that power to go unchecked. Officer Burke's actions in this courtroom were not an isolated incident. They were the culmination of years of misconduct, of using his position to intimidate, manipulate, and control. As the prosecutor outlined the evidence, testimonies, security footage, and Burke's own questionable records, it was clear that the case against him was airtight. Witnesses testified about previous run-ins with Burke, each one revealing a pattern of behavior that was anything but professional. When it was the judge's turn to speak, the entire room fell silent. She was called as a witness, but her role in this case went beyond that of a simple participant. She had been the victim of Burke's assault, but she was also a symbol of the fight for accountability within the system. With the eyes of the courtroom on her, she stood and recounted what had happened that fateful day. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she described how Burke had not just disrespected her, but had physically assaulted her in front of everyone present. She didn't just tell her story, she made it clear that what had occurred wasn't just an act of aggression, it was a violation of the trust that had been placed in Burke, not just by her, but by every citizen he had sworn to protect. When the judge finished her testimony, there was no question in the air. It was clear to everyone that Burke had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His actions weren't just personal, they had far-reaching implications for the community, for the people who depended on the justice system to be fair and just. The defense tried to argue that Burke had acted in self-defense, that he was simply trying to maintain order in the courtroom. But their arguments fell flat. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury could see it for themselves. The judge, having taken her seat once more, watched the trial unfold with a quiet sense of satisfaction. She had stood firm against Burke in the courtroom, and now she was watching as the wheels of justice turned inexorably toward his downfall. The trial had reached its conclusion. The courtroom was filled with a palpable tension, everyone knowing that this moment would define the course of justice not only for Officer Burke but also for the entire police department. As the closing arguments were made, it became apparent that the case was no longer just about one man's actions. It was about exposing the cracks within a system that allowed abuses of power to thrive unnoticed for far too long. The judge watched carefully as the defense attorney tried to salvage whatever he could of Burke's reputation, but it was clear the tide had turned. The jury had heard all they needed to hear, and the evidence was overwhelming. The public and the press had their eyes on the proceedings, and the judge understood the weight of the decision they were about to make. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned, their faces grim but resolute. The courtroom fell into complete silence as the foreman stood up to announce the verdict. Burke, who had been nervously shifting in his seat, was now staring ahead, as if hoping for some miraculous escape. The rest of the room, attorneys, spectators, and law enforcement, waited with bated breath. The foreman cleared his throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Burke, guilty of assaulting Judge Williams during the court proceedings. We also find him guilty of abuse of power, harassment, and multiple counts of misconduct throughout his career." A collective exhale spread across the room. The tension that had built up over the past several weeks finally seemed to lift. The justice system had done what it was supposed to do. Officer Burke, once a figure of authority, was now facing the consequences of his own actions. The judge allowed herself a brief, subtle nod of approval. The battle was over, but the war for justice was far from finished. Burke stood up, his face turning pale. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere for him to go. As the bailiff stepped forward to take him into custody, Burke's shoulders sagged under the weight of his defeat. His career was over. His freedom was hanging by a thread. The judge stood and addressed the courtroom, her voice calm yet filled with authority. This is a victory for the people. For those who have suffered in silence. For those who have been victimized by those sworn to protect them. Let this be a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who wear the badge. With that, the judge turned to leave the courtroom, her expression one of quiet determination. She had done her duty, and in doing so, had set a precedent for accountability and integrity within the system. But as she stepped out of the courtroom and into the hallway, she knew that the real work was just beginning. The department would have to rebuild its reputation from the ground up. There would be more investigations, more hearings, and more painful truths uncovered. The community would be watching closely, and they wouldn't settle for anything less than true reform. Detective Morales, who had stood by the judge throughout the ordeal, approached her as she left the courtroom. "You did it. He's gone." The judge nodded, but the weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. "This is just the beginning, Morales. Burke was the symptom, not the cause. It's time for real change." The months after the trial were a blur of press conferences, reform proposals, and public outrage. Officer Burke's conviction had sent shockwaves through the department, but the judge knew that the true challenge lay ahead. The focus was no longer solely on Burke, it was on the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. She had already begun working with a group of reform-minded officers and activists, determined to implement changes that would address the underlying issues in the police department. The internal investigations into Burke's actions had revealed a network of corruption and negligence that extended far beyond his individual misconduct. It was clear that the problem was systemic, and it was up to people like her to make sure that justice was more than just a word, it had to become a reality. The judge held a meeting in her chambers, bringing together key players from both law enforcement and the community. Detective Morales was there, as were several city council members and leaders of local advocacy groups. The room was filled with the kind of urgency that comes when history is being made. Everyone knew that what they decided in the next few hours could change the course of the city's future. "I think we can all agree," the judge began, standing at the head of the table, "that Officer Burke was not an isolated incident. His behavior may have been extreme, but the culture that allowed it to fester was much more widespread. We have a duty to ensure that no officer, no matter their rank or title, ever thinks they are above the law." She paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle over the group. Then, she continued, "We must create an independent oversight committee that will have the power to investigate allegations of misconduct at all levels. We also need to ensure that officers receive regular and mandatory training on ethics, accountability, and conflict resolution. And finally, we need a transparent disciplinary process that cannot be ignored or manipulated." The room was quiet as everyone took in her proposal. It was ambitious, but the judge could see that the group understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about building a system that worked for everyone, not just for those in power. Detective Morales, who had been a key part of the investigation, spoke up. "I agree with everything you're saying, Judge. But I think we also need to address the culture within the department itself. There's a sense of entitlement, a belief that some officers are untouchable. That needs to change, too. We have to build trust, both within the department and with the community." A city council member, a woman with short dark hair and glasses, nodded in agreement. "The people need to see that we're serious about making changes. And it's not going to be easy. We're going to face resistance, not just from the department, but from people who believe that nothing needs to change." But if we don't do this, we're just setting ourselves up for another disaster down the road. The judge took a deep breath. This will be a long road, and it will require all of us to stand together. But I believe we can do it. We've already made one thing clear: no one is above the law. Now we need to make that a reality every single day. The room was filled with nods of agreement, and for the first time in a long while, the judge felt a sense of hope. It was a small spark, but it was enough to light the way forward. It had been nearly a year since Officer Burke's conviction. The changes that the judge, Detective Morales, and countless others had fought for were slowly starting to take root within the department. The reform initiatives had not been easy to implement, and resistance had come from unexpected places, but the momentum for change was undeniable. Burke's actions had opened a floodgate of truth, one that had revealed the deep-seated issues within the system, and the city was not turning back. The Independent Oversight Committee had been established, and its members were empowered to investigate misconduct without fear or favor. The transparency of the department's disciplinary actions had dramatically improved, with public access to investigations and outcomes. Officers had begun attending mandatory training sessions on ethics and accountability, though some had fought the new policies. Yet, those who did not embrace the changes found themselves pushed out, as their lack of professionalism became more evident in a system that demanded integrity. In her chambers, the judge now sat, looking out over the city that had once seemed so divided but now felt like it was on the brink of something greater. She had not expected the fight to be easy, but the reward had been far more meaningful than she could have anticipated. It wasn't just the conviction of one officer, it was the hope that the system could be repaired and made more just for everyone. The work, however, was not yet done. The public was still wary, and the scars of the past would not fade overnight. But as she walked through the halls of the courthouse, there was a different energy. People spoke with more respect. Officers had begun to realize that accountability wasn't a threat to their jobs but a necessary element of trust, and the community was more engaged in the process of reform. Detective Morales approached the judge, as they had become close allies in this journey for reform. "Judge Williams, I think we've made a real difference. But I know there's more to do." The judge smiled, though it was a tired but content smile. "Yes, there's always more to do. But we've planted the seed. And now, it's up to the next generation of officers and citizens to water it, to make sure this never happens again." The two of them stood together for a moment, looking out at the city below. They had endured so much to get here. The trial, the investigation, the pushback, and the late-night meetings, all of it had led to this point. The justice system was flawed, but it wasn't beyond repair. They had proven that. The judge took a final look at the courtroom where the trial had taken place, now a symbol of justice rather than a place of corruption. "This will always be my fight," she said quietly. "But it will also be the fight of everyone who believes in fairness. It's up to us to keep this going. The work of justice never ends." And with that, she walked out, ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had done everything in her power to make the system better for all. The road ahead was long, but it was now paved with hope, accountability, and the unshakable belief that change was possible.